Thanks very much, Robin, and I hope you folks don't mind that I'm up here, but I've got this and some notes, and I might drop something if I'm down there on the table. So it's been quite a few weeks since I last saw you, and I was just spending the last couple of days looking through some of the materials you've worked on. I can't believe how much work you've done. That's incredible. And I feel really grateful to get to be here today because we're kind of at a pivotal moment with the OCP in terms of we've listened to all those ideas and now we've got something on paper that's going to show us spatially where we're going to go, and your feedback on that is going to help us draft that map that we're going to include in the OCP. So what I wanted to do in my presentation is, I know that you have these in your package, but sometimes people aren't too used to looking at those kind of maps, so I'll go through it and tell you what it all means, hopefully. And then there's a couple of things that I wanted to mention. When we do these growth scenarios, what we're doing is it's a technical exercise where we look at how we're going to grow the number of people. We look at, of course, we're not starting from scratch, so there's an existing land use framework that we're working from, and transportation is key. So those are the three things: growth projection, the land use, and then the transportation networks. So we're going to show you two ways that we could grow. And then I'm going to spend some time describing what I call the typologies or the geography. So I'm going to use these words like center and urban village and so on. And then wrap up by talking about some of the pros and cons of each of those. So let's get into it. So as I said, population projections are important. Everyone remembers we're looking at 100,000 people over the next 25 or so years. And there you can see the numbers, but just wanted to point out this 3.8% growth over those years breaks down to about 1.5% every year, give or take. And that might sound like a lot, but really we've grown over the last 4 or 5 decades about 1 to 2% a year. So we're right in that spot still. So as I said, what we're going to do is talk through these growth scenarios, and the purpose of doing them is that we look at the ways that we can take that population and housing growth and how it's physically distributed around the city, right? And so then what we want to do is analyze if there's better ways or not to do the distribution. And so we ask ourselves some questions based on what we've heard from the community as to what's important to people. And then we determine which of those scenarios are important. So for example, we ask ourselves, is it better to put more housing in this area because we get more walking or people are closer to parks? And then, as I said, it's really important because it ends up in that map in the OCP, which is an official document of how people can use their land in the future. So there's two scenarios. One's called a baseline, and then one's called a quarter growth scenario, and I'll explain that a bit more. So even though we're showing you two things that seem like it's, X and Y, really think about it more as a spectrum. We could make, as you could imagine, tens or, 100 scenarios, but really how can we have a discussion about that? So within each of these there'll be a variation, and we can take bits of one that we like and bits of one from the other that we like, and perhaps end up where we want to be in the future. So here's the first one. And before I kind of launch into the technical nerdy stuff of these scenarios, I just want to mention that when our provincial legislation was introduced in December, it really influenced this work. If there was no provincial legislation, I'm pretty certain, and I see Deirdre nodding her head, that we would have had some different information that we would be presenting to you, and we would have had more robust discussions about where we might add more centers or how big they would be and so on. But the province really said we have to grow around stations, and that's our acronym, transit-oriented areas, or TOAs. And they also said all local governments must have more density in single-family neighborhoods, so the 4-plexes and 6-plexes that we're going to talk about. So what did we do as staff? Well, we had to pivot, and what our baseline is a framework that you're very familiar with, which is the 4 town centers and some urban villages, plus what the province has mandated we have to do. So that's what's really represented here. And I'll go through what these different geographies are. But to have a conversation about growth, we still wanted to explore what else we could do to try and achieve some of those other goals we have. So we call this the corridor growth scenario. Sorry, I'm looking at the screen and the colors are not that great, but I know you have copies in front of you if it's easier to look at that map as I'm speaking. So the corridor growth scenario is the base, but what distinguishes it is looking at more areas around transit where we might want to grow some more in the future. So we call those, on the third dot down, urban village and proposed frequent transit development area, and growth focus areas. And so, thanks, Robin. He's showing you on your sheets where that is. So those are the 2 main scenarios. And what I'm going to do now is explain a bit what we call the geographies or typologies that you see on these maps. The urban centers, the town centers, the urban villages, the growth focus areas, gentle densification, and neighborhood centers. That's a lot of stuff. So let's start off with an easy one that we're all familiar of. This is the largest center that you know. We're in one right now, Metrotown, your downtown. And of course, this is where we have the highest buildings, the most density and growth, and of course, the most robust mix of uses. Now, one of the things that will help you understand these diagrams is that we try to show you the different density categories and colors, so dark purple, and then correspondingly, it's shown here what that is, a high-rise with 40-plus stories. A lighter purple is a high-rise with fewer stories, less density, and so on. So you can kind of understand a bit about the scale of the buildings in that neighborhood. So city-serving, Metrotown is our kind of city-serving center, and then our other 3 centers are one you're going to visit today, Brentwood, Edmonds is the other, and Lougheed is the 4th one. So that's easy, I think. We all know what that looks and feels like. But I'm going to get into the urban village and proposed frequent transit development areas, because it might be terms you're not as familiar with. You might go to Royal Oak and not really think, oh, this is an urban village in the city's plan. I know that most people don't think about their city that way. But these are areas that are located on SkyTrain or Future Bus rapid transit stations. So these are really also transit-oriented centers. The densities are lower. Some of these centers have unique characteristics, like SFU is obviously based up at the university, and the proposed center at Canada Way in Willingdon also is based upon proximity to BCIT. And I just wanted to make sure I've got the key examples of this. And so this term frequent transit development area is also based upon the transit network. And examples of this, which you can see on that diagram, would be the Willingdon corridor. So you would have quite a bit of growth within that corridor from Brentwood down to Metrotown, with some key nodes at major intersections like Canada Way or farther south around, say, Burke or Mosscrop. Urban villages are very similar to what I described, but the difference here is the transit isn't as frequent. So you have bus or buses, but it's not a SkyTrain or it's not a bus rapid transit system. Many of these you know already. I think you're going to Cascade Heights, or at least you're going to talk about it. Montecito is an urban village. So that's the kind of scale that we're talking about. These are good places for lots of housing choice and density, and so you'll see mid-rise to townhouse forms, and you'll also see commercial uses in these communities as well, either on the ground floor of buildings or in small shopping plazas. Okay, and then this is a term we created for this OCP, growth focus areas. What are those? Well, this is partly based upon having the opportunity here is to transition density from some of those centers to our more single-family neighborhoods. You would see apartment-type buildings or small-scale multi-housing in these areas, row house and townhouse as well. These areas often are tied to those transit-oriented areas that the province has mandated us to meet. So you would have a station, and farther out around the 600 to 800 meters from the station area, you might see this kind of density. And as I say, it often acts as a buffer or a transition to those lower densities you see outside of centers. And finally, we have something, the last geography called gentle densification areas. And these are going to transform into triplexes, fourplexes, and multiplexes. One of the key things here, again, is that this is one of the biggest amounts of land base being transformed with this change. And again, really driven by those provincial mandates for local governments to change their planning frameworks. What we show on the corridor-based scenario is neighborhood centers, so more small-scale commercial where you can, what people tell us all the time, where you can walk to those shops or coffee shops or services that you want close to home. So that is a real whirlwind, but I think what's going to really help today is when you're on that bus and you're looking out the window or walking around and seeing exactly what those are. Now, just a quick evaluation. The baseline growth scenario, what is the key feature is it's more growth in centers, so you're going to see more high-rise apartments. And it's also focused on those lower density neighborhoods, so you're going to see more multiplex housing. So that's different than the corridor-based model where you're going to see more apartment forms. So we say here that this has a less diversity of housing options, but it might be easier for some of these developments to happen because you're not having to consolidate a lot of lots. We also would probably see a lot of small-scale multi-unit housing which people could rent out. It wouldn't be affordable, but it would be attractive for families as a rental housing option. And one of the outcomes is there's a new urban village at Holdham Station in that scenario. The corridor scenario, opposite to what I described just in the last slide, more option for different housing typologies. So townhouse, row house, low-rise apartments. I want to make a caveat that both of these scenarios really have really good access to schools, parks, and those kinds of amenities, and that was tested. So we don't see a differentiation in that in terms of access. But what you'll see is more growth along key corridors. Willingdon is one of them. Imperial is another one. So you're going to see changes in other parts of your city that you don't have changed there now. So I think to make sure we have enough time for some questions, and I know maybe that was like a fire hose full of information, but I hope you get a sense of how those things are different. And again, like one of the key things to know in the scenario work is that we're testing to see, is one scenario better than the other? And one of the things that we found that is that they're both good. Like there's no scenario that says, oh, we shouldn't be growing this way, and we really have to do a 180. So that's important to know. There's no one scenario that's going to make it harder to meet environmental goals or make it harder for people to use transit or that kind of thing. So just, that might help you when you're framing your questions. So I have a couple of slides on next steps, but I think in the interest of time, we could talk about next steps maybe at the end of the session today and the next steps are about engagement on this work. So to maybe to be closer so I can hear you better, I'm going to come down there, okay?
All right, and we will turn on the other handheld mic. Oh great, Arthur's got a mic for us, and we're going to ask you to share questions now with Lee-Ann. Who has a question that they'd like to ask? Please.
Hello. Hi, so when you mentioned there's a urban village proposal taking place at a location, I guess my question is how long would that development take for that urban village to be built?
Well, first of all, any center or urban village, they take a long time. Because it takes 20 years, I think, sometimes to really see some of those developments come to fruition. But when we identify a place, the one thing that we would want to do first off is make a plan. And so we would want to work really closely with the community and map out everything and talk about what the forms were like and talk about what amenities we need for that. And our community plans, so Edmonds, Royal Oak, Cascade Heights, they take 2 years. So we would do that. And then once that is settled, then the property owners know the opportunities and development applications start to happen. So it would be a couple of years before we would really start to see major changes in the directions of the plan.
Hi, my name's Lynn. I have a question about the gentle densification area. What will you do in regard to parking? Their laneway access, if someone decides to build a fourplex on a double wide lot, how will the city handle the parking? Because it may become a major issue if you add all that up.
Yeah, so parking is really important consideration. One of the things about these single family lots, if we're trying to add housing, that if you're adding 4 units, that takes up a portion of the lot. But we're also trying to achieve other things like environmental benefits, because we don't want the lot to just become totally paved over with the housing, the garage, the parking pads. We want space for trees. So we're really going to try to limit the footprint so there's opportunity to have open space for people who live there, a deck, a small green patch or whatever, and to have trees. So for parking, part of this is provincially mandated, and if they have said close to SkyTrain stations within a certain area, no parking permitted. And then we're going to have a very low parking ratio on these 4-plex and 6-plex sites.
Other questions? Okay, we've got one over here, and then we'll move over here.
Thank you. My question kind of comes back to your idea of like growth projections. What are you trying to solve? So there's the idea of accommodating 100,000 new residents, and you mentioned around 55,000 new homes in that time. Are we trying to solve the housing crisis during this time? This is 2050, 25 years out, but 55,000 new homes for 100,000 new people, that would only maintain the status quo, assuming the 1.8, 1.9 that we've seen for people per home. And so I really struggle with why are we here? If we're just trying to accommodate new people, we should, very much so. But what are we solving beyond that? Are we just saying we're accepting and saying this is fine for our current housing situation? Because from everything I've heard from city staff, that's what the underlying numbers suggest and what you're trying to do. And that's if that's the case, I don't know why I'm here.
First of all, Jill, so your question is, why are we accommodating and identifying so many areas for growth? I'm sorry, because I read lips, because I also don't hear well. So,
how are we going to solve the housing crisis that we're in now? Because 55,000 homes for 100,000 people, that will theoretically accommodate those people, but maintain the current catastrophe that exists for lack of housing for people that need it now, extremely unaffordable prices for anybody that needs a home now, inability for anybody coming in or trying to move out of their parents' house to find a place to live.
okay,
And so how, all
Yeah.
the numbers suggest we're not even looking at that
yeah.
from what I've seen.
Thank you for repeating that. I appreciate that. So I think the housing crisis is something the city alone can't solve, first off. And what we as a city need to do is try to have a land use framework that's going to be the most responsive that we can. So when we have more opportunities for housing in different forms, that's an important part of it. So this gentle densification, parking notwithstanding, I hear you, Lynn, and I saw some heads nodding, but it will provide more housing options. And then this framework is going to provide more opportunities in row house, townhouse, things that people tell us we don't have enough of. But I think we're talking, these growth scenario maps are really high level. But when it comes to housing, we're still going to do the things that we're doing already on the affordability side. So we are working to create that housing authority, which is important for long-term making sure that we have really more truly affordable housing that has non-market rents. We're also going to continue with our inclusionary zoning policy, and that's where we get 20% of units in multifamily developments being affordable with lower rents, and that's guaranteed by a housing agreement. And so those are the kinds of things that we can do and will continue to try to do to address the housing crisis.
Hi, Lee-Ann. Thanks for coming back and spending some more time with us. I was wondering if you had any more information about the, traffic projections between the two scenarios. I know you mentioned they're going to be both served pretty heavily by transit in either case. But I guess I have a bias towards more grade-separated transit because it's frequent, it's fast, it's reliable, whereas bus fighting with traffic just never feels like that's the case, especially on the reliability front because it could just be stopped up somewhere else. So my bias is towards more of the town centers, but I'm curious about there's more ideas on how this the corridor development will actually really be affected over time with traffic and such.
I haven't looked deep dive into the transportation and the car traffic kind of those impacts, but the model was done in conjunction with the transportation plan, and we like to say that the land use and the transportation, they're like a dance. So when we kind of get to that point where we are set on the land use, we've got a transportation plan, we'll feed that back into the land use plan, and then we'll get this map, we'll feed it back in to the transportation plan. I think you'll see incremental growth in the network. We have no plans to increase road space, right? So we will, I think through time, we'll be able to manage transportation impacts as they come because we are going to shift. We are going to have more people walking, biking, and cycling, and we're going to have more people also taking transportation.
Lee-Ann, in the tour this afternoon, we'll be going by some areas that where we'll be flagging bus rapid transit proposals that Transit's brought forward, and there's an active conversation in the community right now. Are you able to say anything about that so that people can keep that in mind before we go on the tour?
Yeah, I think that the notes you had one or two bullets on it, and it was pretty succinct. So everyone's aware that the proposal is for the rapid transit to come over the Second Narrows Bridge, and then when it gets to Burnaby, the question is, should it go along Hastings and down Willingdon, or should it go down Boundary and then cut over and down Willingdon? And on the one hand, the key is land use that supports transportation ridership. So that would be the route along Hastings. The other consideration is kind of avoiding what people think about Hastings that is special is kind of the way it is now, and going down Boundary to avoid that. What that does is make a land use challenge in a way, because you would have to then in the future think about how Boundary would change in order to support the transit ridership. So that's the discussion.
Okay, thank you. Got another question here.
Just on that. So Willingdon is I guess, a corridor that's being looked at for rapid transit. Are there already considerations in place for how to upgrade, for lack of a better word, Willingdon? It's already a terrible street to drive on in rush hour. It's narrow. If there's a rapid bus, how is that being looked at already, I guess?
Well, we've wanted to have Willingdon become a special street for decades. I guess are people familiar with Willingdon Linear Park? Yeah. I mean, in the 70s, the plan was for that road to be widened and for that to accommodate HOV bus. And so the city had bought up all those lots for that to happen. And about 8 years ago, council decided, no, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to turn that into a linear parkway to connect the Heights to Brentwood. So that's actually really cool story, right? But I know what you say, and what's the number one challenge on Willingdon, especially as you get past BCIT towards Metrotown? It's so narrow. And so we know that any plan to make that a better complete street with room for rapid transit and cycling and walking is going to need a lot of consideration of how you're going to widen it. Widen it for all those other alternate modes. The other challenge about that stretch of road, everyone know how steep it is. So it's hard for rapid transit, to build rapid transit there, but those smart transportation engineers will figure it out. So we don't have a plan for it yet, but this is, part of this would be solidifying that we want ourselves and TransLink to work on that to make it that kind of route that you're talking about.
You've got me nervous now because we're going to be driving south down Willingdon during rush hour to get back here on our bus tour. So let's see how it goes.
You'll
yeah,
be
it's
late.
a Saturday.
You'll be late.
All right, I think we have time for one more question.
Joseph here. What I'm going to bring about to raise is the point of transportation alternatives, and I'm going to emphasize the opportunity that e-bikes give us. And when I'm hearing the planning, I'm hearing a mindset that is decades in the past, and it thinks of buses, trains, and cars, but neglects to think of the changes that have been made even recently and locally in providing e-bikes that can provide transportation for people, even those who can barely walk. And I'm going to mention the local Burnaby company of, what was it called again? Vimo. And the Vimo bike with an enclosed canopy around the rider and electric power and motor can help people who are hesitant to go up the hills of Burnaby and make that accessible and rapid and independent, and lowers congestion, pollution, and does also provide exercise. Is the city planning to make such modes of transportation a priority? Because it also goes very well with the city's plans to produce what they call a zero carbon emission. But increasing busing and providing for cars, that may just be transferring those sources of pollution elsewhere around the globe, while also increasing congestion here, as well as other forms of pollution from, for example, electric car tire particles.
Let's make sure there's time for Lee-Ann to answer the question.
I agree. And I just want to, I'm glad you brought that up. That is really important. I think when we talk at this high level, we don't get down to the kind of topics you're talking about. That is absolutely important for our climate goals. And one of the things that we often talk about is EV as a solution to our climate goals, but that still has a road space challenge and a parking challenge. And we do need to make sure that we have real options for alternate transportation. I totally agree, and I hope that this is comes loud and clear from this group, that that's something that you see for the future.
Okay, thank you so much, Lee-Ann. Everybody has a worksheet 4.1, where you can write down the important takeaways that you have from the presentation and discussion today. Let's give a round of applause for Lee-Ann for taking time off of her Saturday. All right, and we're going to see Lee-Ann again the afternoon of day 5 on May the 4th. Lee-Ann will be part of a housing panel that will include additional experts who will be talking through some of the more detailed housing issues that we're getting into. So thanks so much, Lee-Ann, for making the time.